Vilnius is where I spent the longest amount of time. I was there for 3 months. My first 3 months were in Vilnius, and then towards the end of my mission, I was there for another 7, 8 months. So transportation-wise, in Vilnius and then most of the country, we use, there's buses, so public transportation. And so there's 2 different types of buses. There's some like trolley buses that are hooked into like wires that run through the city, and then there's autobuses that are like a normal bus that will go to either farther parts or places that are just harder to get to. And yeah, so we would always just get a monthly bus pass, and then would then use the buses to get to wherever we needed to go. Depending on the area of the city, if you were in some of the more residential sections, you could potentially walk places, but you would usually ride a bus first to get to the particular neighborhood or area that you were trying to work in. And so Vilnius has there's a city center that's where most of the businesses are, and where the oldest part of the city is, where they'll have like street sellers selling sort of souvenir-y type things, and that's where a lot of like day-to-day activity is. There's a couple really busy streets. Gedimino Prospektas is one, and we would spend a lot of time there contacting people. Yeah, and so there's not a ton of people that live close to the center of the city. Most of the housing is in different areas kind of around it. And so most everyone in Lithuania and in Vilnius lives in an apartment. And so the apartment buildings are mostly like Soviet housing, so just these giant like cement blocks. So they'll either be like 5 stories, or some were taller than that at like 13 stories, I think. And there's usually 3 different apartments per floor, and so they're not very big. They're pretty small. They'll be like a living / bedroom, and then a kitchen, and a bathroom, and it's so most Lithuanians in their apartment, their couch during the day will then fold down and become the bed that they sleep on at night, just because there's not a ton of space and they don't have a ton of money to have like both a bed and a couch. It just makes more sense to them to kind of combine, and because you don't need to sleep when you would be using your couch, so they just use them for the same thing. And that was something that seemed a little odd at first, but then kind of understanding the situation that they were in and the people, they're very, very frugal. Like they barely turn their lights on. So there'd be times when we'd be out at night, and so we'd knock on someone's door and they would open it, and it would be dark outside and you could barely see anything, but they would just be in their apartment in the dark, because they didn't want to spend the money for the electricity for their lights, because that seemed like a useless expense. Like they could get by without it, so they didn't need to spend it. And so so the apartment buildings are kind of grouped in large sections. There'd be like 20 or 30 of them kind of gathered in a clump, and that would be a different like neighborhood or area, and then you could go to different ones of those scattered around the city. And the certain areas would be, there were a couple that were like predominantly Russian speaking, and so we didn't go there very often because we couldn't really talk to very many people. And so that was where there were some Russian speaking missionaries in Vilnius that would then work mostly in those areas. And I mean, in the city itself, there are several different cathedrals, and there's a huge amount of variety in what they look like on the outside and on the inside. So there's a main cathedral which is in the city center, that we would walk by almost every day, more than once. And it just has a big open courtyard around it. Then during the winter, they have a giant Christmas tree that they put up there. That one's kind of this fusion of Greek neoclassical architecture, has columns out front, and then statues of, I think, all 12 of the apostles scattered around the outside. And then there's a giant golden cross on the top, and then inside it has similar architecture in the inside as well. And then we would frequently go into the cathedrals on our preparation day when we'd be walking in the city, and it was it helped understand the different reactions that Lithuanians would have when they would come into our chapels, which seemed to largely fall into two different camps. There would be people that loved how simple and plain the chapels were, because for them that showed that we weren't concerned about appearances and outside things. And then there would be other people that were almost offended by how plain and simple our chapels were, because the kind of extravagance and that large sense of pageantry that their cathedrals had, they associated with a lot of like respect and reverence for God, that they were putting all their finest things there for God to see. Kind of what we do with temples, how in the temple there's always like the finest wood and stone, and the work inside is always as beautiful as it can be. That same sort of mindset is what people would associate with the cathedrals that they would go to, and then would expect to see in the chapels.